Please, I am begging you, untie it. The rancher froze, then broke tradition for an Apache girl. The land was still, the kind of silence that presses down on the chest. The prairie stretched flat and endless, grass bent beneath the weight of a pale morning frost. A thin wind carried dust across the road that cut through the valley, its edges washed in grey light. The sound of boots pressing against the hardened earth was the only proof that someone lived in this vast emptiness. The rancher moved slow, his shoulders stooped under years of work and silence. He was a man known for keeping to himself, for rising before the sun and returning to his cabin after it sank. His hat brim cast his face in shadow, but his eyes missed nothing. He had learned long ago that the land hid things. Broken fences, stray cattle, signs of predators, and sometimes the remnants of cruelty left by other men. That morning, he noticed something strange by the fence line. At first, it looked like nothing more than torn fabric caught in the wire, fluttering faint against the frost. He stepped closer, his hand instinctively brushing the revolver at his side, though he rarely used it anymore. Then, he saw her. A girl, no more than 16, maybe 17, sat on the frozen ground. Her hands were bound with coarse rope, the fibers biting red into her skin. Her dress was torn, dust ground into every thread. Long black hair clung to her face, tangled and heavy with cold dew. She did not cry out. Though her lips trembled, she only lifted her eyes, dark, hollow, and waiting. For a moment, the rancher froze. His breath caught. It was not unusual to find suffering out here, but this was different. She wasn't just abandoned. She was left to be seen. Whoever tied her there wanted her shame to be witnessed. The girl's lips parted. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words cut through the cold air like a blade. Please, I am begging you, untie it. The rancher's hands hovered over the rope, yet he didn't move. Tradition told him to walk away, to not interfere in what belonged to another people's law, another family's punishment. But as he stared at the trembling wrists before him, something deep within him shifted, an old memory pressing against the silence. The morning opened with a grey stillness that wrapped around the land like a shroud. Frost clung to the brittle grass, the blades stiff and sharp in the half-light. An empty road stretched across the valley, flat and silent, the kind of silence that seemed almost watchful. The cabin that sat near the fence line was little more than weathered wood and smoke stains, a place that had stood against too many winters. The wind pressed against its walls, carrying the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. The rancher walked the line as he always did, boots pressing into the hardened earth with a steady rhythm. His life was measured by such rhythms, fence posts to mend, cattle to count, water to draw, firewood to stack. He had long since learned to keep to himself, the wide land offering more comfort than people ever had. His eyes scanned the distance not for company, but for signs of damage. The subtle shifts that meant trouble had passed in the night. That morning, his gaze caught on something small and out of place. A shred of fabric fluttered weakly against the wire, darkened by dirt and torn at the edges. He slowed, suspicion drawing him closer, every step measured. He thought it might be from a blanket, or perhaps some ranch hand's shirt caught and forgotten. But as the wind shifted, he saw it was not fabric alone. She was there, crouched low in the frost, her back pressed against the post. A girl, Apache by her long dark hair and the cut of her features, bound at the wrists with rough rope that cut into her skin. Her dress was thin, torn at the seams, the cold biting through to her bones. She did not fight. She did not weep. She only stared at the ground, her body small and still, as though waiting for the earth itself to swallow her. The rancher stopped a few feet away, his chest tightening. He knew what it meant to see a child tied like this, left by her own, abandoned as punishment, or worse, offered as a warning. His hand hovered at his side, uncertain whether to reach for his knife or turn back the way he came. The girl finally lifted her eyes to him, dark and hollow, yet filled with something desperate. Her lips parted, and though her voice trembled, the words carried sharp through the air. Please, I'm begging you, untie it. The sound froze him where he stood. He had seen cruelty before, but never with eyes like hers staring into his silence. The rancher stood still, the cold air pressing into his lungs, the girl's plea hanging between them like smoke that would not clear. She lowered her gaze again as if ashamed of even asking, her breath shallow, her bound hands trembling against the rough rope. The silence stretched long, broken only by the soft moan of the wind tugging at the wire fence. He had seen wounded animals before, deer caught in traps, cattle lost in storms. But this was no animal. This was someone's daughter, someone's blood. And yet she had been left here, as though her life carried no weight. He felt the old pull inside, the one that came from years he rarely allowed himself to remember. There had been a boy once, his younger brother, caught in a different kind of snare, not made of rope, but of poverty and drink. He had watched helplessly as that boy slipped away, nobody stepping in, not even himself. The memory rose unbidden, carried on the sight of her wrists rubbed raw. He remembered the same hollow in his brother's eyes, the same silent question of whether anyone would fight for him. He shifted his weight, boots grinding against the frozen earth. If he cut her loose, it meant standing against whatever law had placed her here. Apache ways were not his wows. As me, families dealt with their own, sometimes harshly, and an outsider interfering could cost him more than he could bear. If he turned back, though, he would hear her voice in the dark for the rest of his life. He imagined walking home, sitting by the fire, eating his bread and stew, while her body froze by the fence. The thought burned him more than the cold. The girl did not beg again. Her silence became heavier than her words had been, pressing into him until his hands shook. He crouched slowly, his knees aching with the weight of years, and studied her closer. Her face was marked with dust and streaked with faint bruises, but she did not flinch when he met her gaze. She only looked at him as if measuring whether he was man enough to do what others would not. For a long moment he hesitated, knife still sheathed at his belt. His mind told him to walk away, to let the land and its people carry out their justice without him. But his chest told another story, one that would not quiet. He pulled the knife free, the steel catching the faint morning light, and pressed it to the rope. With a single cut, the fibers split. The rope fell to the ground. Her hands trembled as she pulled them to her chest. The rancher stood, shoulders heavy, knowing he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had chosen. He had decided to protect her, no matter what it would bring. The girl's wrists were free, but freedom was not the same as safety. She rubbed at the raw skin in silence, her shoulders drawn tight, eyes darting toward the horizon as if expecting someone to appear. The rancher watched her carefully, waiting for words that did not come. She kept her lips pressed shut, though he could see the fear lingering in the quick rhythm of her breath. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Who left you here?" Her gaze flicked toward him, then away again, as if Eva, and speaking the truth, could summon danger. After a long pause she whispered, almost inaudible, "My own." The words carried the weight of betrayal deeper than any wound. She did not need to explain. Further, he had seen it before. A family that believed punishment was justice, that cutting ties was the only way to preserve pride. But something in her tone told him there was more. As they stood in that cold silence, the rancher noticed fresh tracks in the dirt. Wagon wheels carved deep, hoof prints pressed hard into the earth. Whoever had brought her here had not gone far. His gut twisted with unease. This was not simply a matter of an unwanted girl abandoned to die. She had been left in plain sight, meant to be found or claimed by someone else. He felt it in his bones. Men would be back. The girl seemed to read his worry. Her lips trembled before she forced herself to speak again. They said I shamed them, that I would bring ruin if I stayed." She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "But the truth is, it was not me. It was him, the man who wanted me. They owed him something, and I would pay it." The rancher's jaw tightened. Debt. Trade. She was not just punishment. She was currency. The men who had left her here were not finished. They would return, expecting her still bound, ready to be handed over like livestock. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down his spine. He glanced toward the line of hills, the long shadows shifting as the sun began to climb. Time was short. He had cut the rope, and now he carried not only her burden, but the mark of defiance against the ones who owned this land by blood and fear. The girl's body trembled as if she could already hear hooves in the distance. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and firm, though inside he felt the same storm. "We can't stay here," he said, and she nodded once, her eyes wide. They began to move, his stride strong, though his mind raced. Somewhere behind them, dust rose faintly against the horizon. The men were not far, and when they arrived, they would not come to talk. They traveled in silence at first, the prairies stretching endless around them, the frost melting into patches of damp earth under the rising sun. The girl followed a few steps behind, her arms wrapped around herself, as if afraid even the air might strike her. The rancher did not speak, but he slowed his stride so she could keep up, glancing back now and then to make sure she hadn't fallen too far behind. Each time, she lowered her eyes quickly, uncomfortable under his watch, yet unwilling to be left alone again. When they reached his cabin, a small, weather-beaten place tucked against the hills, she stood hesitating at the threshold. He pushed the door open, the wood groaning, and set his hat aside. Inside, the space was plain, just a table, a stove, a bedroll, shelves with tools and jars. He gestured for her to come in, then set about stirring the ashes in the stove until the fire caught again. The smell of smoke and iron filled the air. Without asking, he placed a tin cup in her hands, filled with warm water. She clutched it like it was gold. That night, after she had eaten what little he had to offer, beans, bread gone stale but softened over the fire, he stepped outside with his rifle. She followed, timid, her bare feet quiet on the dirt. He held the rifle in his hands, then looked at her. No words passed, but slowly he lifted it, aimed at a rock in the distance, and fired. The echo rolled across the valley. He handed the rifle to her, his large, calloused hand steadying hers. She hesitated, then lifted it, the wood heavy against her shoulder. The shot cracked weak, but true. A faint smile touched her lips, fleeting but real. Later, as the fire burned low, she traced the scar on her wrist where the rope had bitten deep. He noticed, and without thinking, rolled up his sleeve to show a scar of his own, a thin white line across his forearm. "Barbed wire," he muttered, though his voice carried more than just the memory of metal. She met his gaze, and for the first time, neither looked away. The scars were different, but the silence behind them was the same. The days passed. With little speech, but in the rhythm of shared tasks, they began to find a fragile understanding. He showed her how to chop wood, guiding her hands until the axe fell true. She, in turn, mended one of his shirts with careful stitches, her small act of gratitude done without a word. At night they sat in the dim glow of the fire, the quiet between them no longer heavy but gentle, almost protective. There was a moment, one evening, when she fell asleep near the hearth, her head resting on her folded arms. He watched her, the shadows of the flames brushing across her face. For the first time in many years, he felt the weight on his chest ease, as though the silence of his cabin had finally been broken by something worth keeping. It was not joy, not yet, but it was a beginning, a fragile peace, like the calm before a storm. The stillness of the cabin did not last long. By the third day, the rancher noticed dust rising in the distance, the kind that only came from hooves and wagon wheels. His jaw tightened. They had come. He did not tell the girl at first, but her eyes followed his, and she saw the faint plume against the horizon. Her body stiffened, hands clutched at the fabric of her dress, as if she could hold herself together with nothing but will. By late afternoon, 4 riders appeared on the ridge. their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. They descended slow, deliberate, the creak of saddles and jingle of spurs carrying on the wind. At their front rode a man with a face like stone, his eyes narrow beneath the brim of his hat. He looked down at the cabin as if he already owned it. Behind him, another held a rope in his hand, coiled and ready, as though expecting to bind what had once been his. The rancher stepped outside, rifle resting in his arms, his frame steady though his heart pounded hard. The girl stood just inside the doorway, her shadow long across the air. His rifle remained raised, though his arms shook with the effort. The men who had come for her hesitated, the fire in their eyes dimming beneath the weight of his resolve. The leader's jaw clenched, his revolver half raised, yet he did not fire again. Perhaps it was the sight of the girl standing behind the rancher, her eyes wide but unbroken, or perhaps it was the silent truth that this man, bleeding and worn, would not move aside. He would fight until the last breath left him, and maybe that certainty unsettled them more than bullets could. One of the riders muttered under his breath, pulling on his reins. Another spat into the dirt and turned his horse. The leader glared long, hate-carving lines deep into his face. For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge, the decision poised to fall either way. Then, with a sharp tug of his reins, he wheeled his horse around. Dust rose as they rode back into the horizon, their silhouettes shrinking into the fading light. Silence settled heavy over the cabin. The rancher lowered his rifle, the strength draining from his arms. He staggered, a hand pressed hard against his side, blood seeping warm through his fingers. The girl rushed forward, catching his weight with her small frame. He did not speak, and she did not ask. Together, step by step, they moved back into the cabin. Inside, the fire still glowed faintly. She pressed cloth to his wound, her hands trembling yet determined. He watched her through the haze of pain, her face lit by the flicker of flame. There was no fear in her now, only a quiet resolve that mirrored his own. They did not need words. Everything had been said in the silence between bullets and breaths. When the bleeding slowed and exhaustion pulled him towards sleep, she sat close, her hand resting against his arm. The night wrapped around them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Outside, the land lay still again, as if it had swallowed the violence whole and returned to its endless waiting. The girl did not speak of her uncle, of debt, or of shame. The rancher did not speak of scars, of loss, or of what the coming days would bring. But in that quiet, they both knew a bond had been sealed, forged in blood and silence. Seasons turned over the land, each one wearing down the scars of that night. The cabin remained, weathered but steadfast, smoke curling gently from its chimney each dawn. The girl grew taller, her shoulders squaring with the quiet strength she had once only borrowed from him. The rancher's limp never quite faded, a reminder of the blood he had spilled to keep her safe, but his gaze softened in ways it never had before. Neighbors spoke less of her past. Whispers of shame dried up like streams in summer. Instead, they spoke of the rancher's stubborn will, of how the girl rode beside him at markets, of how she held her head high even when silence pressed against her. What had been a wound was no longer hidden, but worn like a scar. Tender, yet proof she had survived. There were days of work and small laughter, nights of firelight where no words passed, only the comfort of presence. He taught her how to mend fences, how to read the sky before rain, and she in turn kept him steady when old pain flared in his bones. They did not speak often of what had happened, but it lingered between them like a ghost that, over time, no longer frightened. One morning in late autumn, she placed a small wooden cross near the edge of the field where the standoff had ended. Not for her uncle, not for the men who rode away, but for the silence that nearly swallowed her. She pressed it into the earth with steady hands, then turned and walked back to the cabin where the rancher waited. Life did not become easy, but it became theirs. They survived not as broken pieces, but as something remade. And when the wind carried across the open fields at dusk, it whispered like a hymn, reminding them both that some battles are not won with victory, but with the simple act of still.